In this video, I'm going to be exploring the question of the substance and the practical use of the Stowe manuscript, sometimes called the Stowe Missal, in the context of 21st century Orthodoxy. Where I'll begin by examining the manuscript, what it is, and conversely, what it is not, before moving on to examine its place in the Church today. It must be stated at the very beginning of this analysis, despite the considerable mythology that has grown up surrounding it, that the world of early Irish Christianity is, to us, entirely obscure. The past, it is said, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And at no point of the past 2 millennia is this more true than of that distant outpost of Europe, at the height of what some historians have come to term the Dark Ages. We must rely for our contextual analysis on scanty records of Roman accounts, later medieval historians, and a limited trove of archaeological studies which have happened upon relevant information. It is a matter of historical fact that the first significant post-Roman first-hand sources, both written and archaeological, of Christianity in these isles came about as a result of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, and even then the practice of historical record and the accident of survival of significant enough portions of material to begin to reconstruct a systematic practice and belief took a long time to develop. The Stowe Missal, as it is sometimes called, is an interesting manuscript in that it is something of an outlier to this trend. The title given to this volume is somewhat misleading and is the result of the misapplication of the term dating from the 19th century. The book, which should properly be called a sacramentary, is a vellum manuscript which dates to the late 8th or early 9th centuries. It was written in Ireland and underwent several renovations, glosses and alterations over the course of the several centuries following its creation, all of which vary in competency. It currently resides in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin and contains the following contents. Firstly, excerpts from the Gospel of St. John. Second, the order of the Mass. Third, the order of baptism. Fourth, the order of visitation of the sick or extreme unction. 5. Notes regarding the theology of the Mass. And 6. Various spells against ailments. This list of contents may give the impression of a sort of complete form. However, it must be noted at this point that the actual contents that went into the volume have always somewhat mystified historians. For example, the erratic nature of the selections of the texts for the Gospel of St. John and the notes regarding the theology of the Mass do not seem to present any clear thematic system for their inclusion. I will not go any further in this paper into this point, except to note that it is the general opinion of scholars who have examined the manuscript that the book was created for a specific individual and represents his particular preferences rather than participating in a wider general practice. If you want to examine the specific contents of the book further, transcriptions and translations of the text are widely available, both online and in print. Instead, I'll look at the first of the significant questions. What, liturgically speaking, exactly is the Stowe manuscript? John Ryan, in his work The Mass in the Early Irish Church, gives an excellent account of the likely liturgical tradition out of which the Stowe manuscript grew. He notes that the two Roman provinces of Gaul and Britain were intimately interlinked with one another, with the British Isles after the Roman conquest functioning as an administrative extension of Gaul. From Gaul, Christian missionaries came to Britain, until by the 4th century the island was largely Christian. Hence, he says, the liturgical features which gave Gaul a place apart in the liturgical world were also found in Britain. In other words, the liturgy in Britain was traditionally Gallican. Even when the empire collapsed in the 5th century and Gaul was overrun by the Germanic peoples, the liturgy in what remained of Christian Britain continued to be Gallican. Indeed, from the 5th century onwards, the liturgy in Britain may be described as old or archaic Gallican, because it resisted innovations which the Church in the new Gaul of the Merovingians thought fit to accept. St. Patrick, who we must view either as a historically significant person in himself or as the head of a wider significant missionary movement, was a Briton and would have been liturgically familiar with this Gallican tradition, transplanting the customs of that tradition to Ireland upon its conversion. A trend later compounded and confirmed by Ireland's slow integration into the liturgical sphere of the influence of Wales and the rest of the British Isles. The precise nature of the rite relating to the exact ritual, gestures and the sequence of prayers is obscure because the period between the 4th and the 8th centuries was a time of great liturgical upheaval in the West. Thus, we also see a divergence between the liturgical customs of Lien, Arles and Auxerre during this period. The prominence that was given to the offertory chant within the Stowe manuscript suggests a reflection of the Ambrosian rite, which was at that time beginning to gain wide prominence. Ryan notes that it is probable that the early Irish Mass, if not completely of the Ambrosian type, had many Ambrosian characteristics. He goes on to note that the Stowe manuscript illustrates, in the most perfect manner that I have said, about the eclectic habits of the Irish churchmen in the matter of the liturgy. This theory is supported by certain eccentricities within the text of the Mass. For example, the litany Pace Nobis Domine, which appears in the Stowe manuscript written on a single leaf by an Irish hand. It is found also in a St. Gall manuscript of the 8th or 9th century, though it is attributed incorrectly in the Stowe manuscript to St. Augustine rather than to St. Ambrose. So we may therefore begin to answer the question of what the Stowe manuscript actually is. It is a sacramentary of limited scope, written and compiled in Ireland at the end of the 8th century, probably for a single churchman, or at least a small community. It contains within it elements of the scripture and liturgy which he considered personally necessary to whatever context he was serving in. It is compiled from a series of other sources and presumes a familiarity with an established, though somewhat flexible, liturgical use. It presents an endemic habit of interpolating new litanies and prayers into the liturgy, which continued on in the region for some while, presumably as these prayers filtered through to Ireland from continental Europe. It arises from, and it exemplifies, a liturgical world which was changeable and in flux. It most likely finds its roots in the Gallican Rite, with some notable influences from the Ambrosian Rite, which was gaining popularity at the time. What other influences, if any, it may exhibit from Irish culture cannot be clearly stated, as we have very limited information as to what that culture was. This, therefore, answers the first of our questions, what the Stowe Missal is. Now we will turn to the second question and look at what the Stowe Missal is not. It will be obvious at this point the first answer to the question, as it's already been largely addressed. The Stowe manuscript is not a missal. It contains very little actual liturgical rubrication and text, and bears little or no resemblance to the missals which have come down to us in complete form from elsewhere in Europe. There are no commons, there are no propers, there is no lectionary, there is no calendar. Though the rubrical indications do point to these as having existed, we are entirely in the dark with regards to what these contained. there is extremely limited material as relates to any sacrament except the Mass, baptism and Holy Unction. It may go without saying, therefore, that the manuscript does not, contrary to the significant mythology which has grown up around it, point to an ancient Celtic use. Were such a thing to have existed at all, a question beyond the scope of this paper, precedent for it cannot be found within the pages of this manuscript. The manuscript exists, from our perspective, entirely devoid of substantive written supporting evidence, archaeological or cultural material. It cannot be extrapolated from its existence that such forms of service were in widespread use, nor even in what geographical locality in Ireland such a rite was performed. There are no comments, tracts, epistles, or other didactic material relating to such a use, except certain forgeries composed in later centuries in order to support the primacy of the See of Canterbury over the papacy within the British Isles, and now entirely discredited. If we are to extrapolate into Ireland the pattern of liturgical expression unfolding in the rest of Europe at the time, which it's reasonable to do, we must conclude that it is in fact likely that the manuscript functioned as a local use and exhibits the customs of a specific community rather than a general trend. This premise is supported by certain phrases within the manuscript itself. For example, we see the Stowe memento apparently presupposes an itinerant community when it says itineris nostri, while the Hanc Igitur could fit only with a stable community. Indeed, the predilection for the insertion of new litanies and collects into the material presents the distinct possibility that liturgies in Ireland without the tempering influence of a centralised authority flourished in a much more radically divergent manner than those in the continent. There are some instances at which the Stowe manuscript appears to our eyes to rearrange the content of the Mass, particularly with regard to the intercessions and the Gospel reading. Hunnick, in his article Kerry and Stowe Revisited, presents a possible explanation for this, which would seem to compound the notion that these Irish churchmen were accustomed to conducting such interpolations and rearrangements in a much more free manner than we would consider appropriate in the modern day. Originally, he says, this may have been because in churches where catechumens or penitents were excluded from the Gospel or the Oratio Fidelium, a desire for an intercessory prayer shared by all those present might have been satisfied by a litany, which would in any case have been a less heavy experience than the developed Roman Orationes Solemnes. The Stowe Deprecatio was pro populo, and omnes were urgently invited to make the response. Perhaps for ordinary worshippers, this was the part of the Mass that most involved them, which could explain why, for example, at Riesk, tombstones contain a word twice repeated in their response, Domine. The manuscript as such could only substantively give very limited insight into the practice of the ancient Irish Church. As Hunnick goes on to note, considerable problems are involved in using the Stowe manuscript to reconstruct any concrete liturgical milieu. The first is common to the study of all liturgical texts whose history has been evolutionary, that they are littered with formulae which have long since lost their original relevance. There are formulae in the Stowe Missal that originate in pre-Gregorian or Carolingian forms of the Roman Rite, in a Gallican milieu, in Byzantium and in Ireland. It does not follow that a formula of identifiably non-Irish origin was irrelevant to whoever introduced it to Ireland, nor does it follow that something of apparently Irish background was relevant to every community in Ireland in which it was used. To conclude this question, therefore, we may say that the Stowe manuscript is not a complete liturgical artifact. It does not contain the necessary elements to reconstruct the Christianity or the liturgy of its time. It is unlikely in the extreme that it was representative of a wider practice in Ireland, and certainly not the rest of the British Isles. It is devoid of supplementary textual or cultural context, which would allow us to draw any refined conclusions about its use and origin. The most apposite words, which describe the dearth, are those quoted above. Considerable problems are involved in using the Stowe manuscript to reconstruct any concrete liturgical milieu. The subject of the Stowe manuscript is one that is sometimes contested within the Orthodox Church, as it relates to a supposedly pure Orthodox tradition in the West. It is interesting to note that the manuscript contains the filioque clause only as a later interpolation. However, to the historically literate, this will not come as a surprise. The debate has centred around the ability of the Stowe manuscript to fulfil the function of the Western Rite within the Church. This question is, in our opinion, one which is centred around three principal tenets. Firstly, is this manuscript a true representation of the ancient practices of the Western Church? Second, can this manuscript be adequately used, i.e. does it present a complete liturgical tradition? And third, is it actually practicable? I've already addressed the first of these questions in this video. The Stowe manuscript categorically does not represent a general practice of the Western Church. All that can be said safely and regarding it is that it represents the practice of a particular area of Ireland whose location is uncertain and over the course of a particular time period of liturgical upheaval. Its glosses and its interpolations attest to the fact that those who were using it themselves did not regard the manuscript as the be-all and end-all of their tradition, but were happy to adapt it and change it to a much greater degree than modern churchmen would be comfortable with, as fresh continental influences filter through to them. It has been claimed that the Stowe manuscript represents a tradition universal to the British Isles, which stood fast even by some people say as late as 1171. In my opinion, this claim is wholly without basis and indeed counters the prevailing understanding drawn from Anglo-Saxon and Norman manuscript evidence and archaeology of the manner in which the liturgy evolved in the rest of the UK. It is certainly an incorrect thesis when presented in countenance with the existing evidence of Brittany and the rest of Northern Europe. The prevailing understanding of the development of the liturgy as having manifested itself as variations on a continental precedent remains the best explanation for both the uses of the British Isles as well as indeed the variations found within the Stowe manuscript itself. Turning to the question of whether the manuscript could theoretically be used to reconstruct and resurrect the practice of the place and the time in which it was written, we have to be led by the manuscript itself to suppose that this is not possible. Informed as we are by the comparative surplus of documentation relating to other ancient liturgies, such as the Ambrosian, Gallican and the Sarum rites, we must conclude that the necessary material for such a practice would far exceed the material presented in the Stowe manuscript, which itself never had pretensions towards being such a foundational document. Quite apart from the lack of the documentary evidence, we are unsure of a wide number of, perhaps almost all, cultural indicators, cultural practices and gestures, which we may suppose belonged to the practice of such a community, but which are long extinct. As such, I have to conclude that it is not possible to accurately conduct even the services which do appear discreetly within the Stowe manuscript, if indeed that is what is being proposed. Finally then, considering how one might practically do such a thing, it seems likely that such a use, were it to be invented, would have to rely almost entirely on comparable uses from Gaul and Britain for its core shape and cultural tropes, such as the use of Sarum or Rouen. In this circumstance, it seems highly unlikely that we could really call such a rite Celtic or British, or use any other such of those epithets, as this would be neither what was practiced in the ancient church nor particularly local to any group or geographical area. The Stowe manuscript is a rare survival. It is a fascinating insight into the daily life of the church in a particular location in Ireland at the turn of the 9th century. It represents one part of a fulcrum in the West, in which our current liturgies were going through their great, as Pope Gregory termed it, reformatio. However, the manuscript is not and should not be considered as anything more than this. It is very limited in scope, and aside from being a document of antiquarian interest, has little value in shaping of the Western Rite in the Orthodox Church on the 21st century. This is possibly not such a great loss, and while we may be grateful to those diligent churchmen and archivists who have kept it safe down the centuries for us to examine, we may nevertheless be glad that the practice of such outright interpolation which it exhibits has long since been put to rest.